Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 239. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Sara Winokur about her two new novels, both set in Iceland and featuring a forensic geneticist who uses her knowledge and skills to solve mysteries. Her first book is Double Blind, The Icelandic Manuscript Murders, and the sequel is Ivory Bones, The Lewis Chessmen Murders. In both of these novels, Sara blends Nordic noir mysteries with history and real-world intrigue. Sara was a genetics researcher for 25 years, and she manages to include science, specifically genetics, into her stories in a light-handed way. She also wanted to weave in historical events and mysteries. As a result, Double Blind features a mysterious medieval manuscript of Icelandic sagas, while in Ivory Bones, the mystery revolves around a famous set of ivory chess pieces known as the Lewis Chessmen. In this episode, I'll chat with Sara about her writing journey, how her years of experience working with patients and their families helped her write about genetics in a simple and straightforward way, and how her lineage to a Barbary pirate worked its way into her novel, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Sara Winokur, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
I thought what we could do today is talk about your two new books that you have out. The first one, Double Blind, The Icelandic Manuscript Murders, and the second, the most recent, Ivory Bones, The Lewis Chessmen Murders. What I'd like to do, I think, is introduce people to these books in general. So if you can give us just a little bit of an idea of what the books are about, and in particular, what inspired you to start writing them?
Sure. I suppose I should begin with the fact that I was a genetics researcher at the University of California for 25 years. So the first half of my career was really as a scientist in genetics. So I took a step back because I had a health problem. I'm completely fine now. But at that point, I decided to sort of take on a new challenge. And I had always wanted to write. I had written a lot of scientific articles, but not any body of fiction. And so I decided at that point that that's what I would do. And I wanted to incorporate genetics in a very light way, not super technical textbook, incorporate that into the mystery in both of these novels. I should also say that they are both set primarily in Iceland, which I have visited many, many times because as an American author, I wanted to really really understand that culture and respect that culture. I considered it research, but of course I loved going there.
Just a good excuse.
Yes.
For yet another trip.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, maybe I didn't even answer your question. You wanted to know.
Well, that's good for inspiration. I'd like to introduce people to the books in turn. So
sure.
Let's quickly talk about the first book, Double Blind. Maybe introduce us to this story, and in particular, your main character, Brynja.
Right. So Brynja is in the first book, she is a fairly young 28-year-old forensic geneticist that works at a company in Iceland that has a DNA database, and this is an actual fact that Iceland has a DNA database of the majority of its citizens, and she uses this database to solve crimes, to identify, DNA that are linked to individuals that commit crimes. So she evolved into that career because in the first book, when she was a child of just 7 years old, she had been responsible for taking her twin brother down to a fair, a county fair. Iceland, they're very resilient and want their children to be independent. So the two of them at 7 years of age went down to this carnival, and she was supposed to be watching out for her brother, but she decided she wanted to go on this carousel ride, and her brother didn't. So she told him to just stay right there. I'll be right back. I can see you, blah, blah, blah. And so, as it turned out, when the carousel came to a stop, her brother had completely disappeared. So, from a very early age, she was, traumatized by this abduction of her brother, and she never knew what had happened to him. 25 years later, 23 years later, she started to receive clues as to his whereabouts. These clues come in the form of little snippets of poetry from the Icelandic manuscripts, which are also a real thing. They were written in the 13th century. And so somebody's sending her these really obscure clues as to where he is, but not everyone wants to allow her to know where he is. So there are forces against her, which result, unfortunately, in several murders. So that's sort of the crux of the first book.
Good. Okay. And then when we get to book two, we're still with Brynja, but she has clearly her story has moved on from that first one. So let's talk about the Ivory Bones, which is your newest one.
That's right. That was just published in February of this year. The protagonist is Brynja once again. She is several years older. She is still traumatized by her past. I don't want to give away too much, but in the first book, her father had done some pretty nefarious things. And she has this false belief that sort of buried in her own DNA are these like evil genes that might come out in her, if she were to have a biological child. So she has this false belief, and the entire character arc revolves around her realizing that it is a false belief and that it shouldn't ruin her relationships. I'll take a little bit of a step back. Ivory Bones is a dual timeline historical fiction that also involves a murder mystery. And the historical aspect of it centers around a diary that was written in the 1600s by a captive of the Barbary pirate raids in the North Atlantic. And these were pirates from North Africa that raided the North Atlantic seas and took villagers back to North Africa to be sold as slaves. So this diary is written by one of those captives. It's a fictional character that wrote the diary, but all of her experiences are real, based in historical fact to others that had experienced that particular trauma. So the thematic element here is that Anna, the diarist in the 1600s, had like no control over her life. All these external things happened to her, and she lost her homeland and her family and her, boyfriend at the time. She was relatively young, and everything was taken away from her. And now, in the present tense, Brynja has this false belief that she can't have a family because she's worried about her own DNA, and yet her fiance really wants to have children, and so she breaks off the relationship, and ultimately she realizes that she actually is in charge of her own fate. So that's really about the protagonist arc. In terms of the murder mystery aspect of it, the diarist Anna in the 1600s had inherited, her family had inherited what are called the Lewis Chessmen. And these are really intricately carved chess pieces made of walrus ivory. And they're not your sort of typical bland, relatively bland chess pieces. They have very expressive human faces. And if you go on my website, there'll be photos of them that you can see. Anyway, so she took them with her on this journey, but had left behind three pieces in Iceland because she just didn't have time to gather them in all this chaos. And the murder mystery surrounds the search for those missing pieces. In the diary, there are clues as to where they can be found, and they're extremely valuable. These are real artifacts, and most of them are in the British Museum. There are indeed several pieces still missing. So a lot of the book is based in historical fact, but of course I intertwine fiction with it. So once again, there's a couple of sort of unscrupulous characters that want to find them.
Right, right. Well, let's talk about weaving together sort of real life and fiction. How did you decide upon the Icelandic manuscript that you mentioned and these chess pieces and also the stories from the 1600s? So,
Yeah.
yeah, how did you find those and was that the inspiration for the stories, or did you know you needed something so you went looking for them after the fact?
No, I particularly with this second book, I there was sort of two coincidences at the same time that sort of sparked my enthusiasm for writing the book. As I mentioned, I have been to Iceland quite a number of times, so I knew about this pirate raid in 1627 on Iceland, which was a real thing. And my sister called me one day to tell me, she's a genealogist, or she's really interested in our family genealogy, and she said, do you know that we are descended from the mastermind, this pirate that raided Iceland in 1627? And I thought, oh my gosh. So that was a sort of personal connection to this, not necessarily in a good way, but I can't be responsible for somebody 400 years ago either. So that I wanted to learn more about the pirate raid. And at the same time, I happened to be reading a book called Ivory Vikings, which is a book by Nancy Marie Brown, which presents a lot of evidence for these Lewis chessmen actually having been carved in Iceland. So I just decided to put the two together. And I really love reading historical fiction, primarily because I always like to learn a little something while I'm reading. I love to be entertained, of course, and I really appreciate good writing, but I also like to learn a little something. So I decided to weave in that history.
Well, let's also talk about something you mentioned earlier, this idea of weaving in your background, your scientific background, the light-handed approach to including DNA and
Yes.
DNA forensics and genetics and all of that. Because I imagine that is a rather difficult thing to do. One, to present that in a story, because I'm sure people who don't know a lot about it probably have a lot of preconceived ideas of what it is and what it means and ethics around it and moral
Yes.
questions it raises. But also people who are not familiar with that, who don't work in that field, who don't have that vernacular, probably can get easily lost when talking about it. So
Right.
how do you handle that with a light-handed approach?
Yes, I felt it was extremely important to have a light-handed approach because I know that most people are not, don't have a background in genetics. So, but yet I wanted to, has have that as part of the mystery. I honestly had been somewhat used to explaining genetics in a fairly straightforward, easily understood manner, because I've been involved in a lot of patient organizations and talking to families of individuals with, muscular dystrophy and Huntington's disease. And so I had already had the experience or um, the ability to explain things in a rather, I don't want to say simplified, but like straightforward way. So and I don't, it's not heavy-handed at all. In the first book, it involves a lot of poisons, actually. And that was the method of these murders. And so I have this aspect of DNA being translated into RNA and then into protein. I lay that out as sort of a recipe that similar to the recipes that were involved in these uh, poisonous recipes. So I kind of just tried to make it, almost like a metaphor.
Mm.
Yeah.
Is it possible? Is it possible to make that topic fun in a way? Like, how do you approach it where people are not like, oh my God, science is so hard?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. People have this like preconceived fear. But I just sprinkle it in. It's not heavy-handed by any means. I would say the total number of pages is probably like less than 5% of the book. It's not like really all about genetics. She does work at this genetics company. And to your point of it being controversial, this database in genetics is rather controversial because our DNA is not ours alone. We share huge portion of our DNA with our parents and siblings and children and relatives of all sorts. And and so people in Iceland that did not want their DNA to be in this database still have a lot of their DNA in this database. And
Right.
so there's a bit of controversy there. And I would just I would just suggest that people that are utilizing these websites like 23andMe and Ancestry, that you read the fine print carefully, because your DNA can actually be used for research purposes if you so choose. So if you don't want it to be utilized in any other way rather than giving you information, you need to make sure when you're submitting your DNA that you check that box.
Right. Read the fine print, as they
Yeah.
say. Well, let's talk about setting, because as you mentioned, you had to make several trips to Iceland to get it right. So what was important to you to
Mhm.
include in the book to give people a good basis to understand Iceland, the setting geographically,
Mhm.
physically, as well as sort of all those intangibles, sort of the emotional connection people might have to Iceland. What was important
Yeah.
for you to capture?
So, of course, this DNA database, which is a real thing in Iceland, that's where it all started. But of course, while I was there, I toured the company and just became enamored with these eerily beautiful landscapes and these colors. You would see bright white snow on black lava. And my first visit was during summer, so you see these bright green shoots and the vivid blue ocean, and it's a beautiful setting. However, it's also a little bit eerie because it's a very small in terms of population and size. Most of the population lives in Reykjavik, the capital. But once you get outside of Reykjavik, you start to come across these really remote, isolated farmsteads that, could be 10 miles from each other. And, so I just thought, well, this is a great place to set a murder mystery because your neighbors will have no idea what's going on, so you can, it's, I just thought, and then I just wanted to touch upon, just how creative and resilient and really very generous people there, and also their foods, which are certainly their traditional foods are nothing like we have here, and probably nothing you would actually want to eat. But I did try just about everything.
And did you become a fan of Icelandic cuisine?
Not the traditional cuisine. They used to, because you eat what you have to eat to survive. And these people settled Iceland 1,000 years ago, and what did they have? Not They couldn't really harvest much agriculturally because of the climate. And so they would eat like fermented shark, which they buried underground for months because it contains something called uric acid. And once you bury it, that stuff leaches out and it's no longer poisonous, but it tastes like really disgusting. And they used to eat horse and whale. So traditional foods, no, but they have this new Nordic cuisine, which is just exquisite. And they now have greenhouses that are powered by geothermal energy, and so there's actually a lot more produce and cod that's always been around, but cooked in sort of novel ways and really delicious, actually.
Well, let's talk about the placement of this book because and by that I mean within the genre of what people might understand as Nordic noir. So
Hmm.
there is sort of this category of books, and I think most people identify them with this sort of mysteries, thrillers, or suspense stories set in
Hmm.
this sort of Nordic setting. From your perspective, having now written, murder mysteries set in Iceland, what was your understanding of Nordic noir? What people expect when
Yes.
they hear, okay, this mystery is set in Iceland. I will probably expect what?
Yes. Many Nordic noir authors are much more, for instance, Joe Nesbo and even Henning Mankell are a lot more graphic in terms of their murders, really brutal. I Mine are, yes, they're murders, but my book is, I think, sort of on the edge of Nordic noir, like black noir. Yes, it does involve several murders, but really, it's primarily a story of, a historical story.
So a light-handed approach to the noir genre
Yeah,
too.
yeah, almost like, well, I hate, to compare myself, but I I think I first became enamored with Nordic noir and Scandinavian literature by reading Stieg Larsson's books. And yes, his also involve a murder or two, but it's also a family saga,
Mm-hmm.
a story of a family and these characters and the traumas that happen to them. And I don't want to be so presumptuous as to compare my books to his, but it's more in that type of genre.
Right, right. I mean, it's certainly, as you mentioned, setting plays such an important role, particularly in, if you set a book in Iceland, unless you're setting it in Reykjavik, which is a city like
Yeah,
a lot of cities.
that's right.
You set it out in the middle of nowhere where there's no one else. It's sort of adjacent to the idea of the locked room mystery, right? Because
That's
it's just you. It's just the family, the people you would normally interact with in this sort of isolated setting.
right. And in the countryside, and certainly in the past, they stored a lot of their foods, root vegetables and so forth, in a root cellar. And that plays a sort of predominant role in my first book. So yes, not only they're isolated farmsteads, but even within those, there are places that one can hide all sorts of things.
Excellent. Well, I'm curious, are there more Brinja stories in the future? Are you working on
Ye-
anything currently?
yes, I have just begun to write a third novel. This one will be set in Greenland. I think I've pretty much covered Iceland. And Greenland is a very interesting topic in terms of in so many ways, in terms of, culturally and geopolitical wise and climate change and and the Inuit culture, which is I admire so greatly. So I have started. This will be the third book, and I do consider it a trilogy, although they can each be read independently. And this one will feature, well, Brenda will be involved, but it will really feature her assistant, who is a 20 something, millennial kind of free spirit, but also, very dedicated and intelligent. And she is actually Danish, and Greenland is a semi-autonomous region of Denmark. And so she goes to Denmark and sort of discovers all the stuff going on.
Good, good. Well,
Yeah.
do you have more stories out there that you want to write? I mean, do you keep a list of story ideas, or do you just wait until a book is finished and then decide, okay, what's the loudest what's the loudest idea in my head, and that's the one I'll write next? Or do you have, like, for this series, did you have it always planned as sort of three books? I'm curious how you approach the what's coming next part
Right.
of writing.
Well, in this particular case, I did want to write a trilogy. I just felt like I needed to wrap up some issues with the characters and also bring in sort of a new setting, although still Nordic,
Mm-hmm.
Arctic. Okay, maybe not Nordic. Well, I don't know if you consider it Nordic, but so I did want to write a third novel. But after that, yes, I have. I'm switching gears entirely and going to write a children's book with my daughter that takes place. It's just a children's. Well, I won't go into detail, but she's a great graphic artist, and so she's going to do all the illustrations, and it's going to be about this penguin who is called Macaroni because there really are macaroni penguins, and he ends up on an island of this species of other penguins that he's not similar to at all, and he tries to fit in, and it's all about being accepted for who you are. So that's the message, for kids.
Right.
So
Right.
that's going to be entirely different. No murders, no people. Yeah.
Just penguins.
Yes.
So I usually ask, what other goals do you have as a writer? And it sounds like for you, like, just trying new things
Yes. That's
is
exactly right.
interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I figured, well, several years ago, after a scientific career, I wanted to try something new, and now I've finished two-thirds of it. And once again, I want to try something new. I do love writing, so but I want to try a new genre.
Right.
We'll see.
Right.
Yeah,
Good.
entirely new genre.
Yes, that might be sort of the opposite end of the spectrum
Yes,
from where you are.
exactly. Yeah. So I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Sounds like it.
Yeah.
Well, if people want to learn more about you and the books, look for new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you and that information?
Sure. Well, I do have a website where you can find a ton of information, not only about the two books, but about, traveling to Iceland, about the Lewis Chessmen, about all sorts of things like the poisons that I use in the first book, and just Icelandic culture and so forth and so on. So my website is myname.com. So it's spelled Sarawinokur.com. That's my website. So I would say to start there. And on that website, there are links to where one can find my books, but they really can be found anywhere. Amazon, of course, like everything, but also your local bookstore. We have one locally, the Laguna Beach Bookshop, which is just terrific. But also, Barnes and Noble, they may or may not have it on the shelf, but you certainly can order it through them. Also, there's an organization called bookshop.org that supports independent
Right.
booksellers that I
Right.
would highly, highly recommend. So really should be fairly easy to find the books.
Good. Excellent. Well, Sarah, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with both Double Blind and Ivory Bones. And the third one, we will look forward to that when that's finally released. So
Uh-huh.
congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.